Okay, this is Todd, and I've got another case study for you that came in. It was really a question at a seminar workshop I was doing where a financial advisor was asking about a client of his that was looking at buying a home and paying cash for it. Now, without getting it too complex, they had sold a home some time ago, and they had been renting while they were looking to either build or buy a new property. And they found a property they want to buy. It's about $1 million. And what I want to do is I'm going to go through the paying cash versus borrowing, but I want to kind of approach it from a standpoint that's a little bit different, because his question really was, is the house going to be an expense for my client or not? Because they have it in their mind that if they buy the house and it appreciates, it's not really an expense. He's like, how do I quantify that for them in a way that would help them sort of understand what the true cost of this ownership of this home is over time from a wealth perspective. So hopefully some of you guys are taking a gander at my blog. I post there daily. We've been doing a lot of looking at property values over time, appreciation. That web address is toddballinger.com. That's just www.toddballenger.com. Try to take interesting looks at different things that I get from around the industry. And you can sign up there in the top right-hand corner. Actually, I'll take you over there right now. Let me show you what it looks like. It's toddballinger.com. And you can put your email address up here and get a daily feed of any of the postings and stuff that I do. But a recent post yesterday had to do with the projections for MBA stuff. But related to this particular case study, let me see if I can find an example here. Yeah, here it is. Is the real housing price growth over time, that we feel this housing growth number going up. In other words, our properties are worth a lot more today than they were 10, 15 years ago. But if you adjust them for inflation, this black line, we've actually had very little to no real growth in U.S. housing prices. So a way I often explain that is if I buy a house for $70,000, $72,000 back in 1972, as my parents did, and they could sell that house today for $372. That's the blue line. It feels like you've increased your wealth, but if you want to go buy the same house somewhere else in a relatively same size property and relatively in the same area, you're going to pay $372 for the same house. So that's the black line. It feels like there's a lot more money there, but in reality, when you adjust that for inflation, there really hasn't been a lot of real wealth that's been created. And in many situations, wealth has been transferred away. But let's look at this case, and I'll explain to you, where I'm going with this. Just a concept to kind of, again, put in your bonnet as you think about some of these things. So this client, I'm going to do a simple plan, manage, purchase, $1 million contract price. And on the details, they've already sold their home, so there's no home to be sold. They have the $1 million in cash available to pay cash for this home. So they were thinking about basically the largest down payment you can make on a house, which is 100%. And you can see if they did that, the borrowing here is going to be 0. So the question really is max down. So we're going to call this the max down, and the income they have is $356. They're 41% state and federal tax bracket, and they have no other liabilities. Now the question here is, the advisor feels like consistently over time they've been exceeding 6%, and that over the 30-year period of home ownership, they could generate a 6% after-tax return on that account. So the question becomes, should that client pay cash, or in this specific situation? And I want to point this out because a couple of people have emailed saying that, in some situations, I don't think a client should be investing. They should be paying down their debt. I totally agree. My answer is always, it depends. It depends on the situation. In this situation, this client has several $1 million with a financial advisor. The question is, should they take $1 million from this particular portfolio of investments, because the money's been in that investment portfolio while they've been deciding whether to buy or build a house? Or should they leave it there or leave a portion of it there and borrow in today's current market interest rates? So we just simply go to the borrow screen and we look at the options here, and you'll see the current liabilities here. There are none. They're in blue, but I'm going to leave that expanded. And I've set up 3 options for this client. Pay cash, no mortgage. So the contract price is $1 million. You can see there's no mortgage. So that's option 1. Option 2 is a 50% down with a 50% mortgage. So the contract price is $1 million, but they're going to use a 30-year fixed to borrow at 50%. So they'll be borrowing $500,000, and this particular client is a private client with a financial advisory institution, and they could give them a 5% 30-year rate because of the assets they have with that particular group. 20% down, 80% mortgage. So in this situation, we're going to borrow $800,000 at 5% and only move 20% of those assets inside the home as part of that investment. So again, very easy to set up, and we always want to look at answering the same 3 questions. What's the impact to cash at closing? Well, this is where I want to kind of point out something that's a little bit different here. If they continued to rent, let's just say, all right, we'd have to subtract out their rent income. But they have $1 million cash that would be able to stay invested in that account. If they pay cash with no mortgage, then they're buying a home for $1 million. Their down payment is $1 million. They might have some closing costs, but let's just say they're pretty small. So the cash needed to close is $1 million. So if they have cash available of $1 million, they need a cash of $1 million to close. They have no cash left over on a relative basis. And so first we're saying, in your current situation, you got $1 million in the bank. That's where you are today. If you buy the house, pay cash with no mortgage, you got a house, but you got no cash. If you bought the house with a 50% down, 50% mortgage, okay, there are going to be some closing costs. And let's just say in this case, there were no points or fees. It was just the $2,500 closing costs for this particular private bank. So I really need $502,500 to close. I have $1 million available, remember. So if I go with the 50-50, I get the house, but I also keep $497,500 in my investment account of that $1 million. If I go with a 20-80, meaning I put 20% down and borrow 80, I'm buying $1 million house, but I've got a cash coming in of $800,000 from the loan. So I only need $200,000 for the down payment. Plus the closing costs, I need $2,025 out of pocket. So that means of the $1 million that I have left right now, there's $797,500 left over. So from a cash impact at closing, I can see here, currently I've got $1 million. Buy the house with no mortgage, I have no cash, but I have a house. Buy the house with 50% down, I have the house and $500,000. Buy the house with 20% down, I have the house and about $750,000. That explains the cash position. What about the payment position? How is that going to be different? Well, right now, I have no out-of-pocket expenses except for, I have none, so my payment is a baseline of 0. If I pay cash and no mortgage, I'd have some taxes and insurance, but I just left that blank on all 3 just to keep it simple. So I've got pay cash, no mortgage, I've got no payment, remember? I've got no cash, but I've got no payment. Here, remember I had this $497,500 in cash, but I've got a mortgage now of $500,000, which on an after-tax basis is costing this client 2.95%. Remember, that's EPR, effective percentage rate. If I toggle this up and just collapse this from after-tax to pre-tax, then you can see the pre-tax rate is 5%. That's what he's really paying on a monthly basis. But if I expand and look at this on an after-tax basis in his tax bracket, he's really paying 2.95. And this is at the heart of where the potential benefit to the client may be, is if he's paying a real effective rate here of 2.95%, roughly 3%, and the advisor can earn 6 consistently over 30 years. And that's an if, but that's the advisor and the client deciding that that's a risk they want to take, then there should be a positive impact here to borrowing. Another way to say that is if the advisor earns 2.95% on the investment account on a net basis, then this would be a wash, right? Because he would be earning a return that's equal to the cost of borrowing, and it would just be a net 0. But we're going to use the actual cost of borrowing, 2.95, for these 2 mortgages. That's after tax, because he was interested in after-tax impact. Here's the real interest payment he would be paying, $2,000 or $33.33. Here's the principal portion of that payment each month going towards principal. There's the net payment he would be paying. And then we've got the tax savings here, about 854 and about 1367 in tax savings. So after tax, that client's going to be paying 1830 a month out of pocket, or 2928 a month out of pocket. So I can see that's a negative. So a red number, that's money flowing away from the client. So here comes a real question. Up here, I can still see the cash, right? I got $1 million and no payment. That's the best thing for me wealth-wise, right? To keep my $1 million and have no payment. But the problem with that scenario is I have no house. In this scenario, I have no cash and no payment, but I have a house. In this scenario, I have $497.5 cash at closing. I keep that cash. I keep the house, but I got to pay $1830 a month for 30 years. And in this scenario, I get the house. I keep $797.5 in my cash, and I pay $29.28 for 30 years. As we say, this is really important information to understand the cash at closing and the cash flow at closing. But if you want to take that information from a standpoint and let's say make it wisdom, something that you can act on, you really need to be able to look at what is the financial impact of that over time. And what is our target time frame? Let me move this back up. Our target time frame is 30 years for this particular client. So we look at the wealth impact over 30 years. I can see that from a property appreciation standpoint, this client and advisor feel like 2% is about as high as they would want to go. So now, remember, in this current scenario, I have no house, okay? So there's no appreciation. I get no benefit because I have no asset. Here, if I buy the house, I have $1 million house appreciating at 2% over 30 years. And you'll notice that regardless of how I finance it, the house will be worth $1.821 million in 30 years, whether I pay cash for it, borrow 50%, or borrow 20%. In 30 years, all the liabilities are paid off. The equity is going to be the same from just a property equity standpoint, regardless of which of these three scenarios I go with. Now, what will be different is the payment difference. Over 30 years, if I have, again, the $1 million and no house and no mortgage, I have no payments. But over here, I'm going to have a house with no payments, but I lost that use and control of that $1 million. Here, I'm going to spend $466,279 on interest over 30 years. I'll pay $500,000 of principal back. I'll save $191,174 in taxes. So my net flows away from me are $775,105. Those are the payments I made over that 30 years. So the difference here is I got to keep this chunk of change, this 50% number, $497.5. I can see it right here. But the cost of keeping that $497.5, the net cost to me over that time period was $775,105 out of pocket. Okay? Now, not all of that was expense because $500,000 of that was principal, but that's okay. When I just look at this, I can see this scenario is going to cost me $1.24 million over that 30-year period. That's the cash flow that I would transfer away over that 30 years. But how do you make this into wisdom? If I expand this down here on the savings, because I can answer this question now, is the savings target rate was 6%. So this is what I really want to point out in this case. The best situation for the client is to have the $1 million cash with no payment. Because if they have $1 million with no payment going away, that $1 million at 6% growth rate for 30 years is going to grow to $6 million. So the equity, the wealth that they would have over 30 years is basically $6.02 million. That's the best situation for the client financially. The problem with this is they have no house if they want a house, right? So what we really then want to do is compare this current situation, which is their best wealth perspective, to the alternatives here of paying cash with no mortgage, putting 50% down and borrowing 50%, or putting 20% down and borrowing 80%. And we can actually see that the net equity here is only the house, because all I would have in this situation is the house and its appreciated asset. And if you say, well, but I could save those payments, we're netting the payments out here as a negative number. So we're just addressing and equalizing the payments, here. So here I'd have 1.821 million. Here I'd have 2.767 million in net wealth. That's the value of my house, which again is the same with all three scenarios. And what I have different here is I have 497.5. That was my opening balance. It got to grow at 6% over 30 years. That'd grow to $945,878. So when I add up the house value and the investment account, after subtracting out up here this payment differential, I got 2.7 million, here 3.3. So what I really want to point out is that the house is a net cost. The client would have $6 million in wealth if, okay, they just had the $1 million with no house and no payment. But if I'm going to buy this house and I'm going to spend this money, I'm going to have to transfer away that $1 million into this house. That's going to keep me capped at 1.821 million on my wealth. Here, if I borrow 20 or I borrow 50% and leave 50% away in that account, okay, that's going to grow to 945, and altogether I'm going to have 2.7 million. Here, 3.3. So another way of looking at this is if you buy this house in this situation, paying cash for it is going to cost you $4 million, 4.2 million in wealth over time. Financing it with 50% down and a 50% mortgage means that your net wealth impact is you're going to lose 3 million of this wealth over time. And here you're going to lose 2.6 million. Relative to what? And the way we position this, and while this is a kind of an advanced thought here, but you're saying, look, the best situation for the client is just to keep all the cash, have no payment, and live with their parents. And again, if they were renting, then the rent would become a payment we would subtract out of this. But in this situation, they just wanted to look at what is the actual equity impact here for this client. And in reality, the best case scenarios are up 6 million. Here, they're going to be down. They're going to be up 1.8 million. Here, 2.7 million. Here, 3.3 million. Okay, so if I'm looking at it from a wealth perspective, this right here is the best scenario for me because relative to doing nothing, it's only costing me 2.678 million over 30 years to finance it this way. 20% down, 80% mortgage. Now remember, I said that the real reason this is a benefit to the client is their after-tax cost of borrowing is about 3%, and the advisor feels like they could earn 6%. What if the advisor only earned them 3% in their account over the next 30 years? Look what happens. The equity relative to what they would earn on the million only compounds to 2.45 million. So you can see here it's 1.8, 1.823, 1.828. There's really no difference in any of these three scenarios for the client, except they would have the additional liquidity of having that cash available in that investment account over time. Okay, so all things being equal, the net wealth impact is relatively the same. The real benefit in this case came from that advisor earning for that client his target rate of return, which was going to be 6%. Okay, so just gives you some different ways to think about it. Now, one other thing that came up is, well, this client they do have the $1 million, but they are paying rent. So let's go over here and I'll just show you how to address that. I would come over to the Manage tab, and if I really wanted to do a wealth comparison to renting, I would add a liability. I would call that liability rent. I would come in here and say landlord, and this client was renting an apartment for about $2,500 a month. Now we know that over time rent goes up. So I could inflate that rent by 2%, say the same rate that we think the property is going to appreciate over time. That's just my little inflator for my rent. I just put in whatever amount I want to put in there and hit save. Now when I come back over to the Borrow tab, watch what's going to happen here now, which is going to show up here at the very bottom in this situation. Let me go back 1 second. So by going over here and adding that rent, when I come to this page, up here there's no change, right? This is just my my 3 borrowing scenarios. And it doesn't change my cash at all. That's the same. How would it change on my cash flow? Well, now I've got a negative $2,500 showing up here as a monthly payment. So in reality, the client has $1 million, but they're still spending $2,500 a month for rent. So now everything gets adjusted off of this baseline. I'm paying $2,500 out in rent. Now if I pay cash with no mortgage, I don't have the $1 million, but I'm saving $2,500 a month. But I want to show you how quick that was. We just changed one field, and the software completely re-optimized everything. Now the monthly payment positive here, it's negative here, it's positive here. Now my new payment here is $1,830 a month, but I was paying $2,500, so this is positive $670 in cash flow. And if I do 20% down and 80%, my new payment's $2,928. I'm paying $428 a month more. So immediately I can see the difference between the current renting and paying cash with no mortgage. I free up the $2,500 a month. 50-50, I free up $670. 28, I free up $428. Now let's go right down to the savings analysis. I didn't change another thing, but everything is recalculated now to still show what? I've got the $6 million. If that $1 million can grow at 6%, it's still going to grow to 6.022. Okay, but now what we do is we're now adjusting for this cash flow differential, and you can see here that the equity now is a net 4.3, 5.2, and 5.854. So now, compared to renting, if I pay cash, the house is costing me about $1.69 million over this particular time period. Here it's costing me $744. Here it's costing me $167. That's so. And again, it's a different way of looking at the same numbers to see the financial impact over this target time frame for this client from a net equity standpoint, coming from the house and the investment account. And notice the investment accounts are much larger now. Why? Because now I have no money up front, but I have $2,500 a month going into the account at 6% for 30 years. Here I have $497.5 starting in the account at 6%, plus I have that $670 a month going into it. That's going to grow to $3.45 million. Here I have $797.5 going into the account, but I have a negative $428 offsetting that growth over that time period, and I can still see the financial impact and what's the best thing for this client. And again, if I go drop this down to 3%, okay, even with the cash flow differential, I can actually see here the difference over time. In all three of these scenarios, the client's better off financially now owning than they are renting at the 3% level. It's a better situation for the client. And again, I'm just talking through these things so you understand intuitively what's happening. If they don't buy a house and rent, they're losing that $2,500 a month, but that's escalating at a 2% inflation rate over time. So this is saying this is what this money would grow to, this $1 million at 3%. Here, though, I've got the property growing at 2%, plus I've got the cash flow growing at 6%. Again, this is doing this all for you automatically. So I could go through and model any variety of different scenarios. If I want to drop this back to 5 real quick and see how this works out, I can see the opportunity cost equalized out over that time frame. So I hope this helps. It's a longer case study, a more advanced study, but just want to share with you some of the things that are coming in that I find interesting, that I think you may find interesting as well. So if this was my client based on this situation, and I thought, 5 is conservative, I think I can definitely do 5% after tax over 30 years for the client based on prior stuff. Again, there's no guarantee here, but I can still see that what is my net cost over 30 years? 0, that's my baseline. About $500,000, about 55, or positive $250,000. This still tells me this is a better option for this particular client. If the client was in a different situation, if they weren't going to save that money, let's say they were going to put it in their checking account, okay, and earn a 0.2% return, then I can see which of these would be better. 2.7, 2.4, 2.3. Then in this situation, paying cash for the house is a better deal for this client than it would be financing it over that time period, because they're not going to earn enough money having that sitting around in cash to offset the cost of their interest. Hope this helps.